We're talking to Congressman Alan Grayson. Of course, he represents Florida's 9th District. Congressman, now I want to talk to you about some of the things that you've gotten done in Congress. First of all, this is interesting. You know, you had a hearing plan to bring in Glenn Greenwald to talk about the NSA spying situation. The president happened to call a meeting at the same exact time to talk to House Democrats, so it had to be postponed. Glenn Greenwald had said Obama developed a sudden and newfound interest in the House Democrats and scheduled a meeting with them at the same time. So what do you think happened there? Any chance that that was not a coincidence?
Well, in fact, we've been inundated with so-called information, the same 5 talking points over and over and over again, misleading information from the so-called intelligence community. The morning before the vote on the Amash Conyers amendment, which would have curtailed domestic spying by the NSA, on the morning before that vote, both the Democratic caucus and the Republican caucus invited over General Alexander, the head of the NSA, to address them in a special meeting so that he could give those same 5 talking points over and over again. And it's highly misleading information. I know it. You know, I've been able to compare it to what classified information I get access to. And, you know, they treat Congress, I'm talking about the intelligence community, treats Congress like a mushroom farm. They keep us in the dark, and they spread the fertilizer liberally all over us. And so what I was trying to do through my hearing was to hear the other side. I invited in Glenn Greenwald. He said fine. I invited in the Cato Institute, and I invited in the ACLU to get their perspectives. It turns out that both the Cato Institute and the ACLU understand the Fourth Amendment, and they agree that what's happening right now is unconstitutional and it's illegal. So I wanted to get, for the sake of my fellow members of Congress, the other point of view. And I had both Democrats and Republicans lined up to attend that hearing. There's a lot of interest in it. The president decided for only the second time all year that he really had to speak to us at exactly the same time as that hearing. You can draw your own conclusions.
And I have. So let's talk about something we mentioned earlier in the show, which was the Department of Homeland Security funding bill, in which you got this provision added, that it prohibits funds in the bill from being used in contravention of the First, Second, or Fourth Amendments. Now, it's hard to vote against that. That's why, of course, it got into the bill. But then the NSA spying program, where they're collecting data on 300 million Americans, is clearly in violation of the Department of Homeland Security funding provision that passed. So how do you, then enforce that?
The NSA is actually part of the Department of Defense, but your point is still well taken. And the interesting thing about that is that it's become very controversial that the Department of Homeland Security has used racial profiling. But since the Grayson Amendment passed, and by the way, that was one of 13 amendments that we've already passed, and I've passed more amendments than any member of Congress, either Democratic or Republican up to this point. We've also passed 33 other amendments on the Science and Technology Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, 5 of which have already passed through the House. But in any event, because it's the Grayson Amendment, I get to interpret it, I get to say what it means, and I said in the congressional record that what that means, that the Department of Homeland Security can't violate the First, Second, or Fourth Amendments per the Grayson Amendment, is they can't engage in racial profiling. So now, someone like the ACLU can take the Department of Homeland Security to court and say that they're in violation of the Grayson Amendment as explained by Grayson himself. That was one of the benefits of that amendment. It leads to, first of all, discouraging the agency from doing the things that I say they can't do because I'm the one who wrote the amendment. And secondly, if they do continue to do it, it lays the foundation for a court case, a successful court case against the agency, that they're violating that amendment.
So overall, you've gotten 31 of these amendments passed, according to the latest count. Let's begin that conversation.
The latest count is 13 and 33, but go ahead.
Okay, all right. So that's pretty good, even better.
It was a busy week. It was a busy week. 13 on the floor of the House total for the year, and 33 in the committee. But please go ahead.
So how? How do you get Republicans, and of course the House is controlled by Republicans, to vote along with you?
Well, to some extent, I think we've gotten into their heads. For one thing, they see that there's a mammoth fight on their hands if they don't go along with one of our amendments. In one case, the Republicans said they wouldn't go along with it, and we ended up with a tie vote. And they had to scurry around and make all sorts of deals and make all sorts of promises to their own members to fight back and keep a Grayson Amendment from passing. That's only the second time in the past 5 years that there's been a tie vote in the House of Representatives. And that's not one of the 13. Now, with regard to the 13 that did pass, sometimes it's a good idea and they recognize that, and they have no reason to say no. That does happen occasionally. Sometimes they're scared to say no. Sometimes they realize that if they say no and I bring it to a vote, they're going to look really bad. Just this past week, one of the ones that we passed this past week was one to increase funding for bilingual programs at HUD. Now, it turns out that many of the people who need help from the Housing and Urban Development Department are people who don't speak English. But HUD spends a tiny pittance on translating services, and in particular in translating the materials that they create. It's almost all English, even though much of their clientele doesn't speak English. So I felt bad about that, and I decided to put in an amendment to increase it. It was clear to the Republicans that if they opposed that amendment, they would be properly labeled as anti-Hispanic. We know how sensitive they are about that lately. So they decided to go ahead and pass the Grayson Amendment, and it was unanimous. It happens that we do it sometimes that way. It happens that we do it sometimes in other ways. But the bottom line is that I often think of what will make it appealing to them and to us, even though it's a progressive principle. We had another example recently where I introduced an amendment. Democrats loved it because it was environmentalist. It was pro-environment. Republicans loved it because they thought it was a states' rights amendment. And I was happy to let them think whatever they wanted as long as they voted for it, which they did. Okay. So we were able to put together these unusual coalitions based upon progressive values.
Congressman Grayson, you and I have talked in the past. People go on youtube.com/TYT and see all of our fun interviews. And you know that the thing that I think is the ultimate issue in Congress is money in politics. That until we decide how our politicians are elected through money is fixed, we can't get anything else done. That's my sense of it. Now, can you give me some hope? Is there any way that this Congress can agree to stop funding their elections in the ways that has already gotten them elected?
Yes, and I'll give you an example. I recently got in the defense bill a prohibition against torture. Why? Because the Republicans would have been ashamed to vote in favor of torture. So we have to offer amendments on campaign finance reform that the Republicans are literally ashamed to vote against. A prohibition against foreign companies interfering in U.S. elections. A prohibition against CEOs spending the shareholders' money without the shareholders' approval. I could give you other examples too. We put that in our Save Democracy platform at savedemocracy.net. I have come up with bills that literally they'd be ashamed to vote against. That's my plan. That's what I'm going to do.
Now, I understand that, but the Disclose Act was pretty close to that. I mean, all we wanted to do was find out where the money was coming from, and that's what the Supreme Court, even in Citizens United, had said. Well, obviously they could disclose the donors, and Mitch McConnell turned around and said that that's actually threatening their donors and that they were against it, and they wound up defeating it in the Senate. So it is possible that the Republicans are beyond shame.
Well, they filibustered in the Senate, and that's also sort of a deep problem that you've discussed frequently in the past. There's not only the campaign finance problem, there's the filibuster problem that lets a minority rule a majority time after time and again, as long as they're unscrupulous and do nothing to limit their own discretion.
One quick note on what you just said in the earlier answer. Shareholders are from all over the world, so is it possible that since there's foreigners who are shareholders that we can stop all corporations from giving money through that route?
It's possible, but what we need to do is to force them to defend their position and to vote on it. And we've come up with a program that we're going to spread throughout the House of Representatives, hopefully in the Senate as well, that in committees will force the Republicans to take these hard votes and shame them into doing the right thing.
One last quick thing. Do you have a similar strategy for shaming the Obama administration into actually being progressive?
That ship has sailed.
Well, okay, that's fair enough, and I'll leave it right there. All right, Congressman Alan Grayson, clearly an aggressive progressive right there in the People's Congress. All right, thank you so much.
I'd like to think of myself as lovable, but thank you anyway. Thank you. A lovable progressive.
Well, you can get both. You can get both.